Good morning, folks. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Hybrid Resources Informational Call to discuss the ISO's ACC requirements for aggregate capability constraints, which was recently developed. And given the number of recent inquiries on it as we approach implementation due to the increasing number of hybrid resources coming onto the grid, we're of course happy to hold this call and help clarify any details. We of course appreciate your time and engagement in advance, folks, given the current events, of course. I am joined today by my colleagues, Gabe Murtaugh, who will be the primary presenter for today, as well as John Gooden from our Market and Infrastructure Policy Development Department, as well as Mike Turner from our Model and Contracts Implementation Department, Debbie Levine from our Infrastructure Contracts and Management Department, Andrew Ulmer and Bill Weaver from our Legal Group, and George Angelides from our Power Systems and Technology Development Group. In addition, our calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. And of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. And lastly, of course, folks, if you have any questions, we are taking written questions received in advance and anything taken in the WebEx chats first. And if none of those, or if after fielding those, we'll move on to verbal questions. And for verbal questions, please raise your hand virtually by pressing #2 once. And of course, we request that you state your name and the company that you represent for all questions. And as I see any chat questions that come in as well, I'll be sure to verbalize it for folks. Just a heads up in advance for that. And with that, I will hand it over to Gabe.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jimmy, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We appreciate it. As Jimmy noted, we have had several comments and concerns from stakeholders about how the aggregate capability constraint would work when we're applying multiple constraints at a single point of interconnection. So we wanted to walk through those details in a presentation and a informational paper that we've posted on our website. So I'm going to do that today. I will spend just a couple minutes going through the very high-level background on the ACC, which I suspect that most participants on this call are familiar with, but then we'll get into some of the details about modeling multiple aggregate capability constraints at the same location. So we can go ahead and dive into the material here. Yeah, thank you. So just to walk through the background here, we've identified situations, and this is from our Hybrid Resources Initiative, where we might have multiple co-located resources at the same point of interconnection, and the underlying components, the actual generating capability of those underlying components of the resources could potentially produce more energy than would be possible or has been studied at the point of interconnection. This is particularly prevalent with solar plus storage facilities, and we understand why this might be the case for co-located resources. You might already have a 100-megawatt solar facility that exists at a location, and that 100-megawatt solar facility might have 100 megawatts of interconnection capability with the ISO. You may choose to add additional storage to that facility. So now you've got 100 megawatts of solar plus 50 megawatts of storage. But at the same time, you might not choose to increase the interconnection size from 100 megawatts to something larger than 100 megawatts, even though potentially you could theoretically generate up to 150 megawatts. The ISO acknowledges that this makes a lot of sense given our current market signals. Solar resources are generally online and producing the most during the times of the day when prices are highest. These typically correspond with the times of the day when storage resources would choose to charge rather than discharge and provide energy to the grid. Storage resources are typically incentivized to discharge and provide energy at times of the day when prices are highest. This happens in most locations on the ISO grid during periods after the solar resources are already done generating for the day. So, it makes a lot of sense to just have, 100 megawatts, or it could make a lot of sense to just have 100 megawatts of interconnection at this location, given that you wouldn't ever expect the solar to be producing, or you would rarely expect the solar and the storage to be producing at values above 100 megawatts during most typical times of day, although we do acknowledge that there could be price spikes and things like that in the middle part of the day when there could be generation of above 100 megawatts on the system. Excuse me. The aggregate capability constraint is the tool that the ISO has developed to prevent this from happening. It essentially says that the dispatch instructions to any two resources, so in this case it could be a solar resource and a storage resource, will never exceed the point of interconnection limit. So in this case, if you did have these two resources, we could put this aggregate capability constraint in place, and we would never see a dispatch instruction to those resources above that 100 megawatt point of interconnection limit. And I would also note, and this is something that we talked about at great length in the paper, that this is something that is approved and verified at the time of interconnection of the resources into the ISO. We also verify that there are controls at the interconnection facility that limit the amount of energy that would be injected at any point in time. So we would expect in this example case here that there would be something like a physical run-back scheme that would, any time that the actual output of these two resources was above 100 megawatts, would actually limit the output to just 100 megawatts and reduce the output from either the storage resource or the solar resource to ensure that that 100 megawatts is never violated. And this is sort of, this final bullet is sort of where we're coming to in the conversation today. We've had a number of questions and, frankly, concerns about multiple aggregate capability constraints, or ACCs, being applied at a single generating facility. I think the first thing I would note about this is that our tariff today does not allow for multiple ACCs at a single generating facility, even though the tariff doesn't explicitly prevent this or preclude this. In our FERC transmittal letter for this authority, we did specifically state that we would only ever apply one aggregate capability constraint at a single generating facility. We understand that this is a big concern for some of the market participants that are signing contracts right now and that already have contracts signed for facilities that are coming online very shortly. And this functionality is something that is necessary in order to, sort of make those contracts work and get the respective capacity online in the ISO market. We are committed to making updates to our tariff rules so that we can allow for this functionality. Our timeline that we initially announced and that we've been thinking about has been to get these changes in place for this fall. We understand that might be too far in the future for some resources, and that doesn't meet needs for resources that are potentially coming online this summer. I think I would note that, internally to make these changes, while it's not overly burdensome, it does require a filing with FERC, and prior to the filing at FERC, we would socialize the expected and updated tariff language that we would want to change with stakeholders, and that would take some time as well. But we could potentially move this up from our what we initially stated as a fall filing date. And of course, we need to get sign off from participants here at the, management here at the ISO in order to make those changes, but we do anticipate and move those changes forward, but we do anticipate that we could begin working on that sooner if necessary. And then, once those changes are approved at FERC, the ISO will be able to accommodate multiple aggregate capability constraints at a single generating facility. Okay, so let's go ahead into the next slide, which is just a very simple example of what the aggregate capability constraint does. I don't want to spend too much time, and I think we've pretty much walked through this example just by speaking to it. But essentially, an aggregate capability constraint is the constraint that we include in our model. In this particular situation that's illustrated on this slide, we've got resource 1 and resource 2. Resource 1 is a 100-megawatt resource. Resource 2 is a 50-megawatt resource. Both are at the same point of interconnection, and the point of interconnection limit for injecting energy into the ISO grid is 100 megawatts, and that's been studied by the ISO and approved. At that point, we'll also implement the aggregate capability constraint to ensure that dispatch instructions from resource 1 and resource 2 never exceed that 100-megawatt limit. And in this case, if prices were very high at say, $1,000, and there was availability for both resources to generate, the market optimization would essentially take the least cost energy from these resources first, up to that 100 megawatts, and then it would dispatch both resources to that 100 megawatt point and not beyond. One of the things that we noted in the paper, and I would just note on this slide, is that we really are technology agnostic about these two resources. They could indeed be a solar resource paired with a storage resource, but it need not be the case. These could also be hybrid resources. These could be gas resources. These could be other renewable resources. But it doesn't have to necessarily be a storage resource plus a renewable resource. But most of the examples, I would just note here, most of the examples that we see on our system are of that renewable plus storage ilk, typically solar plus storage. So then going on to the next slide, we make this scenario a little bit more complex. So here we have 4 underlying resource IDs: resource ID 1, resource 2, resource 3, and resource 4. And I would note here that we're illustrating that resources 1 through resources 4 could be from the same generating facility, and thus could sort of get you to this situation where you have multiple aggregate capability constraints applied to a single generating facility. In this case, we're saying that resource 1 has a Pmax of 110 megawatts, resource 2 has a Pmax of 55 megawatts. Similarly, resource 3 and resources 4 have a Pmax of 123 and 62 megawatts, respectively. In this particular case, there is or could be an aggregate capability constraint applied to resource 1 and resource 2 at that 110 megawatt limit. There could also be a second aggregate capability constraint applied to resources 3 and resources 4 at the 123 megawatt limit. These two aggregate capability constraints would align with the studied point of interconnection limit of 233 megawatts that the ISO has studied and reviewed for the overall point of interconnection limit for injecting energy into the ISO. So I think this is a scenario that we've heard from multiple market participants, and the scenario sort of goes something like this, where you have perhaps a large solar resource and a large storage resource at the same location. The solar resource and the storage resource have multiple off-takers assigned to them. So in this particular example, you could have off-taker 1 that sort of gets 110 megawatts from resource 1 and 55 megawatts from resource 2, and a separate off-taker 2, that gets 123 megawatts of energy from resource 3 and 62 megawatts from resource 4. In this particular case, similar to the constraints that we've set up here, the first off-taker is limited to 110 megawatts at any given time from their two underlying slices of the resource, and then off-taker 2 is limited to 123 megawatts. So these aggregate capability constraints that the ISO could potentially set up could potentially match the terms of the contract from the developers of the resources to the off-takers of the resources. And I think the bottom line of what we're trying to say here is that the ISO can accommodate those kinds of arrangements once we make those updates to our tariff that I alluded to back in slide 2. Okay, so final slide here is the next slide. And this is something that we did get a little bit of pushback from some of the early comments that we got from posting the paper. Going forward, and I think this is true about any of our rules, the ISO may consider changes to the rules applied for how you can logically split resources and show those resources in the ISO market. And I think the notes here would be that each additional resource that's modeled in our ISO model increases the complexity and the optimization problems that we have to solve. Adding additional complexity could potentially degrade performance of the market model. So it's something that we need to be mindful of anytime we allow these kinds of changes. And then additional constraints that are imposed on resources necessarily reduce solution efficiency and can lead to overall cost increases to serve load. And I think this is something that we want to be mindful of as well. Like I said, this is something that the ISO may explore in the future, but we're not planning to propose any changes along these lines at this time. And if we did, we would certainly make sure to stakeholder those changes and, ask for stakeholder feedback before doing anything like that. So with that, Jimmy, I believe that we did have some written comments that came in prior to the call. So why don't we go ahead and walk through those comments, and then after we hear those comments, we can go and see if we have any chat comments, and then we can take questions from the phone.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. Yeah, we did receive a couple of questions in advance from Susan Schneider, so thank you so much, Susan. And thanks again, Gabe, for running through the information so we can get to these. So the first question we do have from Susan, what does it mean for the ACC to not allow sub-constraints in the tariff language?
Yeah, so sub-constraints, so if we go back to slide 4, I think we can best illustrate that there. Thank you. So what this shows is that the two constraints that we've got applied here, the aggregate capability constraints of 110 megawatts and 123 megawatts, are sort of working in parallel. So the first aggregate capability constraint restrains the output from resource 1 and resource 2 from ever being beyond 110 megawatts. The second one constrains the output from resource 3 and resource 4 from ever being beyond 123 megawatts. We don't have the capability today to layer these constraints. So we can't say, well, we're also going to put a constraint on, if resource 1 were actually broken down into resources 1 and resources 1.5, we couldn't put a second constraint to say resource 1 and resource 1.5 can never generate more than 100 megawatts, and then resource 1, resource 1.5, and resource 2 can never generate beyond 110 megawatts. So they can't be layered. They can only work in parallel like they do in this particular example, and that's a technology constraint that we've heard from our implementation folks.
Great. Thanks so much, Gabe. And on the same slide, coincidentally, the second question goes to this slide as well. So where in this example that illustrates the 4 resource IDs, where exactly is that prohibited in the current tariff language?
Yeah, I wouldn't, I'm not the lawyer on this, but we do have lawyers on the phone, and I wouldn't say that there's a strict prohibition in tariff language that says, you shall not implement this to multiple generating facilities, or you should not have multiple aggregate capability constraints on a single generating facility. But we did specify that explicitly in our transmittal letter to FERC when we were applying for these changes, and I think it's pretty clear there.
All right, thanks so much, Gabe. I'm not sure if our legal folks want to add to that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hearing none. Operator, would you please open the lines up for any verbal questions? I don't see anything in the chat currently, so thanks again, Gabe.
Absolutely.
Okay,
we have
great.
a few. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Good morning, Gabe. This is Rayanne Quadro from Gridwell Consulting. Thanks for the call this morning. I have 2 questions. Well, 1 question and 1 comment. The first question is the ISO going to allow queue numbers right now to split into multiple GIAs? Meaning, let's say somebody entered the queue with 500 megawatts of storage and needs an ACC for each one. Would they be able to split that single queue position, which came in as a single IR, into 3 separate interconnection agreements?
Yeah, I have, no, go ahead, Deb.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Rayanne, this is Deb Levine. The answer to that is no. And the reason is that because we need one entity that is going to go ahead and manage that full 500 megawatts. So we do allow co-tenancy, and then typically once the however many entities end up putting in place at that 500 megawatt battery storage, they'll go ahead and establish a manager of the battery, and then that manager is in essence the one that is the counterpart that the ISO works with. But we don't allow multiple contracts at one queue number.
Understood, and I was aware that that was the existing procedure, obviously. Just trying to think future planning-wise. And then my comment was when we come back to stakeholder, any changes to this ACC constraint, given that there's a limitation on how much the market system can accommodate number-wise, I would just like to suggest that we think about that holistically, starting in the interconnection policy space about how IRs are submitted, such that, there's at least some confirmation in the beginning that if you're submitting an IR for 500 megawatts or 1,000 megawatts, that the developers are understanding that those constraints are not splittable in a formal way at the end of the process, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Rayanne. That's good feedback. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We do have one more question. Hi, your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Susan Schneider, Phoenix. I have a few questions, actually. The first one is and I apologize, I'm joining a little bit late, so please tell me if you've already done something and I will take it offline. This idea of having a limitation on how maybe you can do this or some vague thing. First of all, I have to say if there is a limitation, you be upfront about it and agree with Gridwell. But also, I think you should fix that limitation because virtually every large project where storage has been added is going to need at least one ACC, and will probably, the large ones probably need more than one because many of them have multiple off-takers. So whatever it is that's limiting your capability to do this, I would suggest that you fix it because you're going to need this, and you're going to need a lot of it. So I guess I would, put that in as a plea to please fix that. The second thing is that I wanted to address this idea that the tariff language doesn't prohibit multiple ACCs right now. And looking at the business resource or business requirement specification, it looks like the software does allow that now. there's this one statement, and I don't know why you put this in, but there's this one, because it was not discussed this way in the stakeholder process, but there's this one statement in the tariff filing that was put in that talked about having one ACC per project. But if that's the only thing that's holding you back, I guess my question is, is there any way to fix that short of a whole other tariff filing? And if you can't do that, when are you going to make this filing? I mean, this really needs to be made like yesterday. So maybe if you could address the question, there's two questions. Why can't you fix just a mistaken statement in a transmittal note that isn't even reflected in the tariff language? And when are you going to make this tariff filing?
Yeah, I might turn this over to the legal team and have them address this.
Hi, Gabe. Hi, Susan. It's Andrew Ulmer. I'll take a stab at it. Thank you for that helpful feedback. So our view of the tariff language as we filed it, and that's on file now, is that we do limit the use of an aggregate capability constraint to a generating facility. I should probably rephrase that.
Well, yeah.
We do limit sort of a single use of an aggregate capability constraint to a generating facility. You
Is it in a language?
I think it's embedded in language 27.13, where we discuss the use of an aggregate capability constraint for a single generating facility. You could have multiple aggregate capability constraints at a point of interconnection, but that would be that would involve multiple. That's a different issue. Multiple generating facilities. So,
okay, but when you said an aggregate capability constraint, you think that means it's not saying, well, you can have an aggregate one here, but it does. You think that limits it to only one? That language?
The way we've written the language and explained it in our filing, yes. So our view is that we need to modify that language to allow for the use of multiple aggregate capability constraints at a single generating facility. And I think Gabe said we're willing to do that. I think what we'd like to do is, of course, prepare draft tariff language and share that with stakeholders and get any feedback and input on that before we make the filing. We do need to, run the traps internally to make sure that there are no concerns with us expediting this effort or doing this without any kind of further policy discussion. But I think the points you've made, and I think Gabe and John concur that we're still within the framework of the policy development process we undertook last year to allow for multiple aggregate capability constraints at a single generating facility. So again, I think, our process would be to step forward and make some draft tariff language changes, share those with stakeholders, and then obviously we'd have to submit them to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for their review and hopefully acceptance. I don't think that would preclude us from working with market participants on the basis of, or the optimistic basis of getting that language accepted, so that as we're waiting for the commission to review and accept that language, we're not wasting time necessarily in terms of folks that are planning to bring their facilities online soon.
Okay.
I don't have a specific date. A specific date when we get you that draft tariff language. Obviously, we would, work to do it as quickly as we can. We have lots of things on our plates, but we do lots of things. So we'll do our best to sort of meet expectations.
Okay. Well, I guess I would say two things. First, the fact that you limited it to one, you believe you limited it to one AC for generating facility was a policy change that was not stakeholder, because it certainly was not discussed that way in the stakeholder process. So that I would say sort of that's one thing. But yeah, I mean, is there, and once you file it, we still potentially have to wait 60 days to actually implement it. Is there any way you can say it would be in the next month you put out some tariff language or something like that? I know the rest of the filing was fairly well developed, and I think you had actually put out draft tariff language in the rest. I apologize if I'm remembering that wrong, but I thought you'd already done that. And so if there's any way to expedite this, get it out there in the next month, it still means like 2 more months that people have to wait. So, if there's any way to commit to that.
Understood. We understand the interest in seeing this move as quickly as possible, so we'll do what we can.
Okay. When can you tell us when you might have a more definitive schedule at least? Yeah, and I hate. I'm sorry to be pushy, and I really am, but if people are negotiating PPAs now and looking for this confirmation in types of documents, and it's been. I would appreciate the informational paper that was put out. I think it needs some work, obviously, but we appreciate your efforts in getting that out the door because that will help. But without that a little more certainty about what it and certainty that it will be allowed, it is actually holding up commercial arrangements.
No, we understand. I mean, I can't give you the certainty here on this phone call today, and you're not being pushy at all. Just expressing a need and a viewpoint. We appreciate that. Optimistically, I would hope we could do it by get something circulated before the middle of next month, maybe even before. But I don't have a precise date for you. Maybe we could follow up, Gabe, Jimmy, with some type of more definitive schedule once we've had a time to discuss that internally. I'm not sure we need to get a market notice out about that. I think you might be able to share some type of email with interested participants, and obviously we'll do what we can to meet your request.
Yeah, it seems like the changes themselves would be fairly straightforward. In that one tariff section and correcting the statement or revising or clarifying, whatever it is you want to call that, the statement in the cover note. So it seems like that would be relatively straightforward.
Yeah, the language in our tariff with respect to the aggregate capability constraint is not extensive, so we should be able to make relatively concise changes and get that out. I agree.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
We do have
Thank you,
question.
Susan, and thank you for those clarifications, Andrew.
Would you like to take the next question?
Yes, please.
Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Gabe. It's Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions. Thanks for the call this morning. Hey, Gabe. Mm-hmm. So just had a couple thoughts. I was reading through the actual posting of the paper, and the last part on page 5 under the deliverability and resource adequacy section seemed a bit concerning to me just in one of the statements where you guys were saying that they could reduce efficiency and increase price and might need to be reconsidered if you can apply this. And I think it's similar to kind of the stuff that you're talking about on slide 5 in the presentation too. And I guess I just wanted to see what you guys were meaning by that, or ask, do you guys intend to get rid of this ACC concept, or just limit it to a certain number in the future or something? Because I kind of shared some of the concerns that Susan raised with the idea that this is going to probably be needed more and more in the future as one thing. And then the other part of it is, I guess, it was my impression that the whole ACC concept is really actually more efficient because it's actually letting the ISO access all of the resource or resources or underlying, generating units within a point of interconnection in a more efficient manner rather than just having the PMAX artificially limited to the interconnection amount. So it seems like it actually lets the ISO have more efficient use. And I understand there's a difference between the efficient dispatch of the megawatts of the resource versus the efficiency of the actual market optimization, and how these constraints impact that. But I guess I would just suggest that the language that you guys are using is a bit confusing on that aspect.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with you. I think an efficient way to handle, a single solar resource and a single storage resource that have a POI limit is an aggregate capability constraint. So I would agree with that statement. But when you have a single storage resource and a single solar resource behind a POI, and you have multiple aggregate capability constraints applied to those two resources underneath of that POI, like in the second example that we present here, the additional constraints, and if you have, more than one scheduling coordinator managing each of the resources under each of these constraints, you won't be able to get all of the capacity potentially from those underlying resources because you're limited by the constraint, which is, not to be too blunt here, but, artificial because you could potentially get all of the generation from your underlying resources if they were just modeled as a single resource in the ISO model.
Uh-huh.
So, I think the key point here is that, this is just something that we're thinking about right now. It's not something that we're, actively developing policy on or anything like that. And if we do decide to develop policy on it, we're going to make sure to stakeholder this, and we'll clearly articulate what our concerns are and why they are in any such proceeding that we have in the future. But right now it's just sort of, putting it out there as food for thought.
Okay. Well, thanks for the feedback, and it actually helps clarify a little bit because I think maybe just your example on slide 4 here that you have up is a little bit confusing to me in that I guess it seems like this is actually 4 separate resources that are all going to one POI when I think the concern that you're expressing is if it was just 2 separate resources with perhaps 2 limits on it and like maybe, 2 or 4 different off-takers or something like that, so that there's a commercial need for it, but not necessarily like a physical need of splitting it up into so many ACCs. So I think that might be just a little bit more of a nuance in the example or something that makes it more clear to me now that you explain that. So thanks for explaining the thinking behind that. That makes a little bit more sense now to me, that the way that you guys are describing it, and I kind of understand the efficiency concern there. So, I guess I'll just wrap it up with just saying that I do encourage you guys to try to see if there's a way to, be able to ensure that these can be used into the future as far as like the market optimization goes, like what Susan was mentioning, but certainly understand the concern, and thanks for the clarification on that. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Gabe.
Thanks, Chris. That's a good question. And if we do, put anything out there in writing on this, we can make those additional clarifications. I think that's important. Thank you. Operator, do we have any other questions?
I have one other question here. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Scott Anderson with Salt River Project here. Could you back up a slide to example 1, please? I wonder if you can just maybe talk a little bit about, I think everything here is very clear, but when you talk about having more than one ACC, the first thing that comes to mind is that you'd have an ACC that's, the combination of both resources are 150 megawatts. And then I guess another option might be to use one or both of the resources, probably more so the battery, for maybe ancillary services for a shorter period of time. But can you provide some examples of what multiple ACCs would look like in using, kind of example 1 as the backdrop here?
Well, frankly, maybe I'm missing the question here, but I think that's precisely what we're doing in example 2. We're saying if you would like to apply, or if there's a need to apply multiple aggregate capability constraints to, multiple underlying resource IDs at a single point of interconnection, example 2 sort of illustrates how you could do that. And in the example, it's relatively straightforward because we've got 2 resource IDs feeding into a single aggregate capability constraint. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You could have multiple resource IDs, more than 2, under a single aggregate capability constraint. And you could also have, as we've illustrated in example 2, multiple aggregate capability constraints, again, with multiple number of resources underneath of them, feeding into the same point of interconnection. I think once you get into actual scenarios with numbers that where you have multiple resources, it's hard to display on the screen, and it can get confusing quickly. So we tried to do the simplest possible example with 4 underlying resources and 2 aggregate capability constraints, but you could certainly grow that as wide as you want to. Does that help, or did I not understand your question?
Yeah, I think it helps.
Okay.
All right, and at this time, I don't see any other questions.
Thanks. I do see we do have one more written question from Michael Volpe from PG&E. Thanks, Michael. Michael asks, can the CAISO comment on roughly what percentage of co-located resources in the interconnection queue are, quote, nested or multiple ACCs versus the traditional configuration or one ACC? And I'm told we don't see that in the queue, Michael, so unfortunately can't clarify that, but that's the answer I'm told. So, and I don't see any further written questions. So with that, Operator, I'm not sure if we see any other written questions, but Gabe, I'm not sure if we have anything more to add to the presentation, so feel free to.
Nothing else to add. Thank you, Jimmy.
Okay, I'll give a few more seconds for folks to enter the queue for any final questions. Otherwise, we do appreciate this, folks. As mentioned, this was recorded, so you can please look out for that to be available in the next couple of business days. I do see another question that popped up from David Brown of CDWR. Thanks, David. He asks, how is the ACC handled in the hybrid model?
Yeah, so you could potentially have, so if we go back perhaps to slide 3 again, where we have this, simple example with 2 underlying resource IDs and 1 aggregate capability constraint, either resource 1 or resource 2 could potentially be a hybrid resource, or they could both potentially be hybrid resources. In that particular case, you still have the same functionality where the aggregate capability constraint limits the dispatch that you'd see from the combination of resource 1 and resource 2 to, in this case, 100 megawatts. But it doesn't matter the technology type of resource 1 and resource 2. Does that answer your question, David? Of course, you're on chat, but that's what. Okay, thanks. Great.
Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, David, you can push pound 2 if you want to verbalize anything, but you did say yes, so thanks a lot, Gabe.
Okay.
And I don't see any further questions, so with that, folks, once more, we appreciate your time. Thanks again, Gabe. And, of course, you can look out for the recording, as mentioned, to be available soon. And with that, please have a great rest of your day, folks.
That concludes our event. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.